some gangster shit. That summit was crazy. It was a shopping center where I remember where the staff office was. I wanted to give you one chance at the end of the interview. Just you have some great light moments in this book about the absurdity of foreign trips too. So a very serious question about the international order implications of Copenhagen, and the lighter point of just clearly made a point in the book to lift up kind of what you and I used to joke about in top 10 lists and things like that of the kind of absurdities of foreign travel for a president. I wanted to how much Copenhagen was a part of that as well.
Look, I'll take the second question first. All of us have some pretty great stories about foreign travel and bilaterals and summits. Part of the point that I try to communicate in the book is this stuff looks fancier, and it has a bunch of flags and limousines driving up with kings and prime ministers, et cetera, getting out of cars, et cetera. But oftentimes they're not. It's organized like a trade show or a convention, right? You got the big round table in our case, but you've got the pen and the pad, commemorative pens, and some of them don't work that well. Some of them are really nice. The Chinese always had the fanciest stuff because they were trying to show off through how nice their pens and pads were. And, you got the mints, and sometimes there's snacks, sometimes not so much. And, you've got the photo with everybody and with the cheesy wave but I think as you guys will acknowledge, at least during my presidency, what was still true. And I think this is what was lost during the Trump presidency, and I think will be a necessary challenge for the Biden-Harris administration to confront. We still set the agenda in these meetings. And if we didn't set the agenda, there wasn't nobody else had the combination of technical skill, bandwidth, diplomatic experience, relationships, trust, and power to be able to stitch together various interests to arrive at something like a Paris Accord. And, I think what Copenhagen showed, and I talk about how Ban Ki-moon, who was then the UN secretary, kept on nagging me about how I needed to go, and me trying to put him off because it wasn't clear that we were actually going to be able to get any kind of deal of the sort that people wanted. At the time, everybody wanted a binding treaty of the sort that had happened in Kyoto, except America had never signed up for it. And we didn't have the votes in the Senate to have a binding treaty like that, nor did we think we should have a binding treaty in which China, India, the fastest growing emitters, had no responsibility. So we knew we couldn't get that. So there was an instinct, I think, in on the part of a lot of us in the administration to say, well, we shouldn't send the president to something that we know is not going to work.
Yeah.
And the UN's trying to organize with 194 countries, and they all have delegates. And poor Denmark is being asked to work with the UN to somehow hammer agreement. And as I point out, Denmark and all the Scandinavian countries, they punch above their weight. I mean, they're terrific, they're smart, they're humane, they're thoughtful, but they're still tiny countries. China's going to be muscled by Denmark into a deal it doesn't want. At the end of the day, even though it was last minute, we are the ones who come up with a plausible formula and then have the muscle both to say to the Europeans, this is as good as we're going to do right now. Let's go ahead and take this quarter of a loaf and build on it. And then to say to the Chinese, listen, if you don't take this deal, we are going to do everything we can to make sure everybody knows that you didn't take the deal. You're the reason that we didn't have an agreement. And the prospect of potentially providing mitigation and adaptation financing for poor countries and island nations that are being swallowed up by the oceans, that's going to be on you, not on us. We're the ones who are able to see and then broker that kind of deal. Now, what that I think points to is the fact that sometimes we have in our foreign policy thinking this on and off switch where we think either the U.S. is this dominant hegemon and everybody has to fall in line to whatever it is that we want to do. If you're not part of the coalition of the willing, we're not going to do business with you. We're going to punish you. We're going to muscle you, as the attempt the Bush administration made during the Iraq War. That's one view. And then the second view is that we're just one nation among many nations, and we shouldn't be arrogant in that way. And our role is simply to try to see if we can arrive at global consensus. Well, what Copenhagen showed is you're not going to get global consensus with 194 countries. The fact is, some countries, in the case of climate change, some countries are the big emitters. Some countries are the bigger economies. You're going to have to get agreement from them first. And in a multipolar world, what you have to do is to still assert American leadership, but that leadership is exercised in a different way. The leadership is exercised by example, right? So we start taking steps ourselves to deal with climate change so that we can then go to other countries and say, see, we're taking this seriously, you need to also. It involves understanding what the other big countries are thinking, right? So I can't have a conversation with the Chinese about climate change if I don't acknowledge that they still have 300 million people who are in extreme poverty, and that the Central Committee in China is constantly obsessed with the destabilization if they cannot stay on a 6% growth rate or 7% growth rate, because they're not going to be able to employ all those folks who are coming in from the countrysides. And I have to understand that India has to figure out how to electrify huge swaths of the country, hundreds of millions of people who just don't have basic electricity. And I have to understand the Europeans' view that they have already made investments in clean energy. Yeah. And so they're trying to figure out, well, why is it, if we're doing it, why is the bigger emitters doing anything, right? So the role ends up being one of convener, agenda setter, persuader, example setter, but that's still leadership. It's not as if you then pull back. America is still central to getting the kind of international cooperation on big issues like nuclear proliferation or climate change or disaster relief or dealing with a pandemic. We're still central to that process, but how we exercise that power it's critical to be able to persuade and understand the perspectives and dynamics in these other countries. It is not, here's what we're going to do and everybody else has to fall in line, because the time in which we had that kind of power, which by the way is always overstated, otherwise we wouldn't have had Vietnam, we would not have had OPEC, right? I mean, there are all kinds of things that happened even at the zenith of American power. The world was always messier than we understood. But what we have to recognize is that other countries caught up. And